Hello, my name is Celine Barabee, and today my presentation and my senior pro-seminar thesis is on the capitalization of property taxes in the value of property, specifically within the state of New Hampshire. So a little bit of context, I am from New Hampshire, so I'm really interested in how our state receives tax revenue. Our main source of tax revenue is from the taxation of property, since we don't have a sales tax and we don't have a state income tax as well. There are taxes such as nursing home facilities, taxation. We have gas tax included in our prices, as well as a regular prepared food tax, aka a meal tax. However, because of this lack of taxation, I was curious to see if that lack of an extra source of revenue would make a difference in how much people are paying for property via the taxes. And it's not uncommon to hear of people in my state complain about property taxes. And according to some research, it's not uncommon for a household to pay amounts similar to property owners in California or Massachusetts, but I will get into that a little bit later. Each town in New Hampshire is an individual jurisdiction with autonomy over its taxation rate setting mechanisms. So those will include the county tax, the local education tax rates, state education tax rates, and just the town tax in general. And what we find is that resident attitudes toward the property tax, specifically within my town, are that the school system is what they're willing to pay for, and hence why the local education tax rate is so much higher, a percentage of the total property tax rate. Whereas in other locations of the state, a lot of people value their municipal services such as plowing or their transfer station more than they value education, but I will talk about that later. New Hampshire does border 3 different states such as Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine, and a little bit of Canada, but we don't talk about Canada. Vermont's very rural. The entire other side of the Connecticut River is small town life. Most of the urban areas of Vermont are in the northwest section. Massachusetts is relatively urban compared to us, so we have a high influence of that kind of culture. Around 70,000 residents in the past 10 years have moved from Massachusetts to New Hampshire, so they are influencing our new tax breakdowns when they vote in local elections and town hall meetings. Maine is relatively rural, especially across the border over in eastern New Hampshire and up north, so there's not a ton of influence up there. However, the populations do start to become more sparse when you get closer to the border of Maine. However, regardless of all this, residents throughout the state have different motivations for choosing and residing in their towns currently. I do conduct a survey and present this data later on in my presentation, and it kind of confirms some of the attitudes that have been conveyed throughout my 21 years of living in New Hampshire. They do vote on their tax codes. They do vote on how much they're willing to increase or decrease their tax rates by. However, a majority of that increase or decrease in the total property tax rate is due to the state assessor, and I will talk about that later on. So some questions that I had going into this were, is the property tax appropriately capitalized in housing values? Meaning, are these tax rates reflected within the property values? Are the residents moving to these towns and paying via taxes what they looked for? Does their house, does their property, does everything that they live by reflect what they're paying? Is it worth it to them? So, like, a great example is with education. If the public education in my town is so highly valued and one of the best in the country, are my tax rates supporting this? Are my higher, probably 70% of our total property tax rates reflecting in our education system? I don't specifically talk about education quality due to lack of data, but I do explore this a little bit in my analysis and through some of the literature. Another question I had to ask was, are residents aware of these tax breakdowns? Are they satisfied with what they're paying? because mortgages will absorb a lot of the tax rate when you're first moving in or you're still paying it off. Some people may not be aware. However, if you are aware, are you happy about this? Is there something that you would do to change it? And in my survey, I do ask these questions. So my hypothesis is that if the property tax is capitalized in housing values, which I use the housing price index, then an increase in the average value of housing for the year should be accompanied by an increase of the property tax rate for the same year. The effect can be mitigated by testing town characteristics, and I chose unemployment, town population density, and local education tax rate, just to explore to see if these correlations will coincide with the literature. So, quick outline, contribution of the literature I'll be reviewing, and then the literature that I actually did research and bring together in my citation of my paper. My tests, my results, the survey I conducted and those results, and my concluding remarks. So first, how am I going to contribute to the literature? New Hampshire is understudied and pretty unique, and I found that through hours of research that not much has been done. Most education, tax, and property research has gone towards exploring California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, some of the most highly valued properties throughout the country. However, New Hampshire is considerably rural and the amenities aren't as abundant as, say, Massachusetts or California, but the monthly property tax payments can be greater than $1,000, and specifically in my town, that's not uncommon, and I show that in my survey. There is a negative effect of local education tax rates on housing property values that I found in my tests, which is not conclusive because we have around 60 towns missing from the testing, but it also doesn't agree with the literature because the literature was saying that if you have an increase in your education tax, it serves as an amenity. If you're going to fund that amenity more, you should get an increase in this quality, but I'll explore that later in my testing section. So let's review the literature. Hamilton in 1976 stated that amenities differ among jurisdictions, and in New Hampshire, those are the individual towns. But those differences should be reflected or must be reflected in the property values. Now, this is the whole idea of capitalization that I'm really interested in exploring. Are residents getting what they are paying for? And then Henderson in 1985 explored the elasticity of supply of housing and the relevant benefits and what those costs to the residents are. And the public services should be capitalized in property values. That's very much in agreement with what Hamilton said. It's that what you're getting in your town services, whether that be plowing, transfer station access, or repaving, park maintenance, etc., that should be reflected in your housing value. Your house, it shows what you value because you're located in that town, and that town provides you services, hopefully, so that should reflect those values. So a question that I also had was, are these prospective buyers shopping for their optimal bundle per Henderson? Are they considering their tax? Are they considering what's worth it to them? Pullman and Smith in 1998 agreed with Henderson and Hamilton, saying property tax should be considered as an amenity, and the structure and the quality of the public services can be analyzed linearly. Now, I don't completely agree with this because a lot of this has to do with rates, and my test will find that there's not a perfect linear relationship. We do have some variation in services. It's not a one-to-one increase, basically. And Fisher in 2009 calculated the burden of the property tax amounts that each household pays. Now, average American pays around 2% of their personal income to the property tax amounts that they pay to the state. And in New Hampshire, that's no different. I don't have complete data to back this up because not all that information is available. But I did find that interesting to include here, since New Hampshire state revenues, most of it comes from tax revenues or property tax revenues. So it would be interesting to see if there is a similar burden on the households, considering it makes up the majority of the revenue. Latz was a great focus in all of the other papers that I referenced, and so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at him. He referenced the housing market bubble in 2008, and basically he came up with this huge bubble completely wiped out any dependability in determining the appropriate property tax. We saw price gouging, we saw complete inflation and overvaluation of housing. So, is that really reflective of the values or what residents are willing to pay? And he also found that revenues lag by at least 1 year, so it's not that dependable to see these huge increases in year N and then determine if that's appropriate for revenues in year N. They should be in year N plus 1. So what may be valuable today to somebody may not be valuable tomorrow, and that the housing bubble completely destroyed that reliability in providing that information. And policymakers they contribute to this problem. They will respond to overactivity in the market. Basically, if there's a large house price increase, they will provide and implement offsetting mechanisms to make sure that it's not too much of a burden on residents. However, the general appreciation of housing, which is usually around 3%, they don't do much to offset because they understand that the cost of living, inflation, and other monetary factors will help them increase their revenues from year to year for local funding. So now for my testing. So I used panel data. I collected it myself from a variety of New Hampshire state resources, different bureaus and offices, and compiled it into one set of panels. There were 153 towns analyzed out of the 263 towns and townships and grants within New Hampshire. So I looked at the average housing value, the HPI, and wondered if it was affected by the total property tax rates, which I label as total tax. And the total tax is broken down into individual rates, but the one I explore in depth is local education tax rate. The unemployment rate and population density are characteristics of the state and their individual jurisdictions that might inform why the HPI may or may not increase on a given year. And we account for these rates by taking the log of each variable and to create new ones, LP, LT, LTE, and LPE. Now, the effect of the total tax and edutax. An increase in the total tax decreased the log of the HPI, and we can expect this from the literature. An increase in that tax rate can lead to a relative decrease in the HPI. However, an increase in the local education tax rate should not decrease the HPI. If you're going to be paying more, you should expect better quality per Henderson and Hamilton and Pullman and Smith. You should expect that the money you're funding, or the money that you're providing for funding, should be increasing the quality, if not maintaining the quality of your school system, specific to local education tax. And if that's decreasing your housing value, then I'm guessing and hypothesizing that this decrease is reflected in a decrease in the school system quality. But like I said, I did not test for it, so I can't completely conclude on this. The effects of the town characteristics, we saw a positive correlation between the log of the unemployment rate and a log of the population density, but they're statistically insignificant, so I can't make any concluding remarks. Like I said, my focus was more so on the local education tax rate, since it is a part of the property tax. So altogether, in a complete absorbed regression, these variables work together to create the equation that you see here. And it's still interesting to see when all characteristics are considered and when the town is absorbed and we are looking at each individual year, that our tax rates will decrease the HPI no matter what. And this is a little concerning. However, our R-squared didn't show complete description of the data, and our standard error was relatively low, in between the range of 0.022 and 0.574. So the data is a little accurate. However, because we have a lack of towns and we have a lack of years, considering we only analyzed from 2010 to 2018 with completeness, there's definitely more research to be done. I'm sure that there's an explanation for why there's a negative effect on the HPI via the increases in total property tax rate and local education tax rate, but I can't be completely conclusive. Now, I surveyed 100 randomly selected New Hampshire residents, and only 82 responded. So right there's a little bit of human error to be considered. However, I was just looking more so to inform my research with real people and their thoughts. I created 6 questions and answered in completeness. 82 of the residents did respond. However, these respondents do remain anonymous, so I do not know who they are and what their feelings were. Except for what they wrote, I can't identify anyone. So, of question 1, approximately how much do you pay in property taxes per month? Now, this goes back to the beginning when I said that it is not uncommon for people to be paying over $1,000 per month in property taxes. And that's about 33.33% of the respondents. They pay between $751 and $1,000, as well as $1,000 per month in taxes. So it's a very even split. So the majority of the respondents are paying more than $750 a month. Like I said, that's very comparable to 3 of the most expensive states in the country. And we have 20.99% of the respondents paying between $100 and $500. That's not a lot, but for a small town in rural New Hampshire, that is a little bit more understandable than over $1,000. But we understand that a lot of people come here for the school systems, and I have literature in my paper and references to back that data up. Q2, Q3, and Q4 all meshed together. They were all building off of one another. So understanding the property tax rate breakdown, the majority of people did, a little bit under 70%. However, there were around 14% of people who did not, and a lot of that has to do with their mortgage absorbs these rates for them, and they don't have to look at the bill every single time. However, that information is available to them. They just don't take that extra step to analyze it. And that's no one's fault. That is a personal preference. So, with knowing that, do they believe that their municipal services reflect the amount they are paying in property taxes, whether they know their breakdown or not? And the majority of people or respondents said yes, they did, which is really good to hear. And that is where this question arises again, is why is there a negative effect on the HPI from an increase in the local education tax rates? If you believe that the school system, which is a service that the town provides, has great quality and it's worth the money that you're spending, why would there be a negative increase? So that data and that test does not align with resident attitudes, which is what I was really interested in. Question 5, per Hamilton in 1985, a lot of people should be looking at their optimal bundle, and that means considering the total property tax rate and even the breakdowns. I can't conclude about or make a remark about people who did not consider their property tax rate, but more than 70% of the respondents said that they considered their tax rates, considering that they were paying for this, they were looking for a good school system and they were looking for a good quality of life. So of course they're going to consider how much they can afford and whether it would be worth it to live in that town. And my final question was, of the reasons that you moved to the town, what was your top? And it's very clear that the location, New Hampshire is a beautiful state and it's rural, and there is access to a couple major highways. It's not too far from Boston, depending on where you are in the state. And there's access to mountains and the beach. It's a very good central location for a lot of options of recreation and employment. But school systems were number 1. And I can't conclude as to where these people are living. Like I said, this was a completely randomly selected group of respondents, and not the majority, but above 30% of the respondents said that the school system was their number one reason for moving here. Once again, why is there a negative increase in the HPI if there is a positive increase in the local education tax rate? Of course, we need more data, but it would be interesting to see what these 34% of the respondents would say to that data. And finally, my concluding remarks. These regressors are statistically insignificant at the 95% confidence level, so it's important to understand that market changes, elections, business cycle fluctuation effects, I can't make any remarks on them, and most of the data that I used, since a lot was missing from other towns and I had to leave towns out due to missing information in the years, it's going to be a little bit harder to create an accurate and representative test. So there's human error and there's also data error there. However, my survey gave me a little bit more information into what I should probably be looking at in my test. Like I said, school systems, really important. We shouldn't be seeing a negative correlation there. So I would really like to see more research done on this area. Maybe people with more money who can get access to the state, they are looking for hundreds of dollars to access some of this information. It would be great to see more research done on each individual town and hopefully get those numbers published. The FHDA did not have complete information on every zip code within New Hampshire, so that made that data hard to track with accuracy. And the quality of the school system may not have a substantial effect on the housing value. Maybe that's just something that people don't care what they pay. At that point, they're just looking at the school. You could have a stellar school system but pay relatively low in local education tax or property taxes. So that would be another interesting thing to look at, maybe via test scores or placement in college or GPAs in high school, the amount of AP classes offered or taken. There are many ways you could evaluate this effect. But in the end, it is what is the residents' willingness to pay. If they don't care how much their property taxes are and they're just willing to pay top dollar, then we can't really look at these town characteristics as being capitalized into the property value. So, like I said, more research must be done with more complete data, and maybe with the negative correlation between the local education tax rate and the housing values. There might be some misallocation of the funding. However, it is highly unlikely considering that annual reports by the state and each town are given every year, and residents do vote in local elections and cooperative meetings about their school systems on whether or not they should increase rates for funding teachers or funding STEM programs. For example, my town 2 years ago voted to spend $1.5 million on a new turf field for the football team. I'm not sure if this is highly related, but the football team did win the state championship the next year. So maybe that would be a piece of data that would either skew or help inform the data. More education funding or more recreation funding will increase success in that area. So that would be really interesting to take a look at down the road as more data becomes freely available over the years. And finally, HPI values are subject to the state assessor's report. So it's highly biased depending on what the state assessor would like to see. When people make improvements in their home, that will automatically increase their HPI, the HPI for the town, regardless of what kind of updates it was. So resident preference should be reflected in the market values by whether they prefer to have an updated or a little bit more older home, or the state assessor should consider revenues when making these reports. However, it is claimed that the revenue goal for the state each year does not reflect what the assessor values your house or property at. So it would be interesting to see how this plays out over the years, especially with differing federal administrations and different housing and human development secretaries up at the federal level. So as the end of my presentation and my thesis, I really appreciate you taking the time to look at my paper and hear my remarks about it. I really look forward to your feedback. Thank you.